President has declared a state of national emergency.
Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and today I want to explain the functioning of an important process that anybody who gets even close to the federal bureaucracy is going to come in contact with. But this process isn't necessarily widely or even well understood. It has to do with the president's ability to declare a state of national emergency. In fact, a lot of times people ask, how do we keep ending up in these wars when Congress never declares war? Well, you see, scattered throughout U.S. code are a whole bunch of legislative rules that the president can modify, bend, or even ignore if he declares a state of national emergency. For example, federal employees get an annual raise in January based off of a calculation set by Congress. But if he declares a state of national emergency, the president can make all kinds of adjustments to that annual pay adjustment. And there are a lot of these powers, depending on who's doing the counting and exactly how they go about doing it. Estimates range between about 117 and upwards of 500. So you can imagine that the president might want to declare a state of national emergency so that they can get their hands on these powers. And the U.S. has had an entirely predictable arc when it comes to this phenomenon. Abe Lincoln was the first president to declare a national emergency back during the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson issued an emergency proclamation back in 1917 in order to boost the amount of shipbuilding going on. And by the time FDR was president, these declarations of national emergency were becoming fairly routine business. So much so that by the time Gerald Ford was in office in the late 1970s, there were some zombie national emergencies just kind of shambling around. And there was some concern by Congress that these presidential powers might be used outside of the scope of the emergency that initially invoked them. So, in 1976, Congress passed the National Emergency Act, which has since been codified into Title 50, Chapter 34 of U.S. Code. And for our purposes, the big thing about the National Emergency Act is that it put in place rules for initiating a national emergency and terminating them. The president still has broad authority to declare a state of national emergency, but he has to do two things in order to access those powers. He has to communicate to Congress what powers he's going to use, and then he has to publish it in the Federal Register. More interesting is how things get terminated. Congress can enact a law that terminates a national emergency. Now, of course, this is going to be kind of rare because that would require a lot of bipartisan cooperation, but it serves as a protective measure against a rogue president. Of course, the president can terminate a national emergency anytime he wants. But the interesting thing is that there is also a provision for automatic termination. Essentially, the president has to reaffirm a national emergency annually by notifying Congress and publishing in the Federal Register. And if they don't, then a zombie national emergency simply turns to dust. There is a really good recent example of this. In February of 2019, President Trump declared a national emergency on the southern border, and he invoked only two of his hundreds of authorities. 12302 of Title 10, which lets him involuntarily mobilize reservists, and 2808 of Title 10, which is a military construction authority. This one is actually a favorite of national emergencies because Congress is very specific about how they want military construction money spent, and this one allows the president to just use it however he wants. Anyway, February 2022 rolls around and President Trump continues the national emergency. Now, one interesting thing here is that they do not have to reiterate the powers that they're accessing with the national emergency. And before I wrap up, I'll show you why that's important to us. And then, on January 20th, 2021, the day he took office, Joe Biden terminates the state of national emergency. All politics aside, this is a nice little vignette about how the National Emergencies Act functions. Now, why should you or I even care? Well, for one thing, keeping track of all these national emergencies is a pretty complicated process. And you never know which one of them is going to suddenly pop out of the woodwork and catch us by surprise. It is so complicated that the Congressional Research Service continually updates their report on these powers. In fact, there's currently 36 national emergencies currently in effect, and one of them goes all the way back to Jimmy Carter. Now, to be fair, a lot of these national emergencies just have to do with blocking property associated with certain countries. Iran, Syria, Belarus, Zimbabwe, Yemen. But there are two that really jumped out at me. Number one, the September 11th inspired Declaration of National Emergency by reason of certain terrorist attacks. And number two, the COVID-19 national emergency. In particular, I have this nagging suspicion that the Involuntary Retiree Recall Authority got invoked by one of these, and that either the Army doesn't know that it's still in effect, or worse, they're pretending they don't know. So I'll get a video on that together quickly and link it to this one. And in the meantime, watch these two videos to get some background.